Hello, creeps. This is Peter Lorre, and tonight we have a guest appearance of our friend, the Shadow, one of the most fascinating characters in the business of crime detection. He's the man who is always getting shot in his invisibility.
What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Sorry to interrupt, boys.
The Shadow.
Yes, the Shadow.
Out over the cold hills to the state's prison.
Shadow comes for revenge.
The computer's going to tell us who the Shadow is.
The Shadow knows.
Surely you're not afraid of death.
Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Agents of the Shadowcast report for the only podcast on the internet devoted to the immortal Avenger of the radio, comics, pulps, and more. We are, of course, the Shadowcast. It's been far too long, but we are going to start off with a bang. Quite literally, we're starting off with the Black Master. Now, this is a pulp story that I recently recorded an audiobook. It's not one that has attracted as much attention as I feel it should have. Really, what this represents as a pulp story is the first attempt from Walter B. Gibson to begin honing the idea he first developed on The Red Menace, which is the fourth Shadow story. And that is essentially a story involving a supervillain. Now, the Red Menace, the Red Envoy rather, was not treated, if you went back and read it, as we covered it on the Shadowcast in one of our recent episodes, he wasn't treated necessarily as a supervillain, more like a crime boss, more like a spy, something like that. And there's still a little bit of that vibe going on here. But with the Black Master, I feel like we are well into supervillain territory, super crooks, whatever you want to call them, master criminals. Walter B. Gibson actually had a lot of different names for them. But as we've talked in the past, this is a case where Walter Gibson was cycling through different kinds of stories. He had his crime stories, his mystery stories, his globe-trotting sort of adventure stories. He had his heists and so forth. Lots of different sort of formulae for the Shadow novels. And his argument was, we want to try and keep the readers invested. So I throw out a lot of different ideas. I kind of have a bunch of different formula, and then we sort of cycle through them, right? To keep the variety going so people don't get bored. And one of the formula that he develops almost immediately, and it winds up being a huge invention, is the supervillain story. Walter B. Gibson, for all intents and purposes, created the supervillain. Without these kinds of characters, the Black Master being one of the greatest, in my opinion, certainly in the early years, you don't get the Joker. You don't get all of these incredible Batman and Spider-Man and X-Men villains. I don't think comic books really would be the same without stories like this. The Black Master represents a perfection and polishing of the formula first presented on The Red Menace. And this is, I feel like this is better in some ways. He's still very much working on it, though. We're not quite all the way there. There's some somewhat predictable twists, I think, would be my primary criticism with this story. But the thing is, it's so well written, and more importantly, there's a strong literary theme here. Like, this is, Walter Gibson said early on when he was writing these Shadow novellas that he really was approaching it like a novelist. He didn't have a background in pulp writing. He wanted to get into the formula because he knew that it was something that paid well and he needed some way to support himself during the Depression, and that certainly worked out for him, for sure. But he didn't particularly feel a lot of affinity for the pulp writers. He sort of approached it like a novelist. You can definitely see that in the early stories, especially the opening trilogy, which somewhat deliberately paced for a pulp. I would say probably too much. And speaking of the pacing. That's probably one of the great selling points here for the Black Master. One of the reasons I would strongly recommend this as one of the strongest efforts, certainly in the first 10 Shadow novels. And this is number 8, by the way. It was published in March, it has a cover date of March 1932. That probably means it was somewhere in February. But of the first 10, of that first sort of year of the Shadow's publication, this would be one of the ones that I would unreservedly recommend. This and Red Menace are right up there. And I think as a supervillain story, this takes it further. This is better than the Red Menace in terms of that kind of a story. And one of the things that it does really well, that some of the prior Shadow stories haven't done that well, is, my God, does it start off with a bang, a boom even. The man with the briefcase brushed shoulders with a man who was going the other way. It was one of those unnoticed passings. A few seconds later, each would have forgotten the existence of the other, had the usual law of the city held true. But this passing was the forerunner of an unusual event. Before the hurrying men had moved 10 feet along the street, a terrific explosion occurred. Where 3 men had been momentarily grouped, none remained. You know, Gibson gets some stick, I think undeservedly, for some of his stories, but it is a legitimate criticism in a way, depending on what you're expecting from a pulp story. Pulp writers generally start on action. That's a very, very common, especially with a vigilante kind of magazine like the Shadow magazine from back then. But one of the things that he gets stick over is sometimes starting out a little slow. I would say Walter Gibson has slower starts than most pulp writers, generally speaking, but much stronger payoffs. And that's probably something that owes to his inspirations being actual novelists and so forth. I mean, he name-checked people like Hemingway and John Steinbeck. These were the people that he considered sort of his peers. Raymond Chandler was apparently a big influence for him, although you really couldn't detect it from reading his actual prose. He was a huge fan of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. I guess if I have any gripe with the story, it's probably the big flaw, which is he takes a little while to introduce the character of, well, either Henry Arnault, the alter ego of the Shadow in this particular story. We've dispensed with Lamont Cranston for this particular story, and you'll find out why in a little bit. But we don't even introduce the Shadow until I think the end of the 3rd chapter, in fact. And it's just a rolling peal of laughter as he drives away past some FBI agents. It's a creepy moment, actually, but kind of, you know, you're waiting a long time for a magazine called The Shadow to actually introduce the Shadow. The Secret Serviceman's automobile remained across the street. The lights in the upstairs apartment went out, but the government men continued their vigil. In their keeping was the safety of the man in whose hands might lie the key to a nationwide plot of which the Manhattan explosions might be but forerunners. A car going rapidly passed close by the parked automobile. The sharp eyes of the Secret Servicemen were busy as they peered into the darkness of the passing coupe. It contained only the driver. One of the Secret Servicemen sat up suddenly and nudged his companion. "Did you hear that?" he exclaimed. "No," said the other. "What was it?" "It sounded like a low laugh, like a whispered laugh." The eyes of the watchers followed the tail light of the coupe until it disappeared in the distance. Make no mistake, it's a cool way to introduce the Shadow, but man, you're really testing the reader's patience waiting, 3 chapters, and at the end of the 3rd chapter to even introduce your hero. But instead, we kind of have an interesting case. So first off, we should say there are agents in this particular issue of the Shadow, but there is no proxy hero as such. All the prior adventures have had some kind of proxy hero, or at least a little bit of one up until now, of course, but especially in the first 3, right? This has been the formula of Walter B. Gibson. Instead of having the Shadow front and center, it's one of the things that makes him unique compared to Batman or Superman. The story isn't all about Batman. The story isn't all about Superman, right? Instead, we take the Shadow, and he's sort of this agent of vengeance. He's almost this supernatural force. So he's still got this mystique about him, whereas I think Superman and Batman have pretty well lost that mystique after decades and decades and decades. It's one of the great things that a good Walter Gibson Shadow story does. It's been very economical in terms of how it uses its hero. This is interesting in that this is essentially a solo Shadow story. You know how you'd get those episodes of Batman the Animated Series where, yeah, Robin's technically around, but it's really just about Batman, and as a kid you were always wondering, well, what the heck? He'd get in some death trap and you'd always wonder, like, where's Robin? Why doesn't he just bail him out? It's kind of like that. It's a little bit like that. Now, you do have a little bit of Harry Vincent in here, a bit of Clyde Burke, somewhat confusing because there's a Detective Burke in this story as well. So, and they're spelled exactly the same. This is kind of something that I would imagine Walter Gibson got notes about because he doesn't repeat this error again that I can remember. There's a few other characters and so forth, but you kind of don't have a proxy hero, but you have something almost approximating it, and that is Dr. Heinrich Zürndorf, a German criminologist who speaks with the most ridiculous, over-the-top 1930s German accent that I think I've ever read. I love that Walter Gibson actually kind of writes that into it. You know, you could practically hear him saying, yeah. And I love the character, but you have to admit, perhaps this is one of the ways in which the protractions of time have not been kind to the Shadow. Keep in mind, this is prior to World War II that this story is published. So the idea of the by default evil German was not established yet. Nowadays, if you were to be watching a children's cartoon about a superhero or something, and everybody's wondering who the bad guy is, and then random German guy with a twirly mustache shows up, and out of nowhere, we've never met him before. Gosh, but I wonder if that guy is the main supervillain. I apologize for the spoilers. It's not much of a spoiler because this is one of the rare cases where Walter Gibson's misdirection doesn't work so well, but I don't think it's his fault. I think for the most part, it's the fault of time. You know, this has now become a trope where the German guy who's supposed to be good is actually the villain. But honestly, one of the great testaments to the strength of the Black Master as a classic Shadow story is that it really does not matter that the character, you kind of guess that he's the villain almost from the very beginning. And it's I mean, really, in terms of concrete plot details, you don't begin to sort out that he might be the Black Master until a little bit into the story. I'm probably selling it a little bit short. There's a particular moment where Henry Arnault gets involved in the mystery, and then Heinrich Zürndorf just pops up at a convenient time to conveniently kill one of the henchmen that could have revealed what the Black Master's identity was. I think most readers kind of figure it out at that point, what's going on. But I'm telling you, even if I'm spoiling it for anyone here, you need to read The Black Master, or you can go listen to the audiobook if you can put up with my hammy performance. But it's definitely one of the better early Shadow stories. So essentially the plot is that there is now a supervillain in New York. Essentially he is planting bombs at random places, and the Shadow very quickly starts to put together, like, wait a minute, these seem like random bombings, and initially the police suspect that it's communistic terrorists.
You figure there's communists in back of it, observed the inspector. It certainly looks that way. You ought to know, coming right after May Day, when we broke up those celebrations they tried to hold. Looks like a straight-up Bolshevik move. A campaign of terrorism, that's what it is. We want to stop it. Soon. They picked the spots all right, said Cardona. Ah, yeah, agreed Dr. Zürndorf. We think there were 4 killed in the Classic office, and there were a lot badly injured, said Cardona. We've identified the managing editor and 2 reporters, but we think there was another there, a Russian. Zürndorf raised his brow. A cab driver brought him to the Classic office along with one of the reporters, Tucson. The other reporter, Grimes, met him. It may be that the Russian was going there to warn Rayner, the managing editor. There was a $5,000 reward, you know. It is strange, said Dr. Zürndorf. This very strange, yeah? These men that say they are communists, that want no money, they are the first to try to get money when it is offered to them.
An interesting little factoid that you're not going to see much in superhero fiction, even superhero fiction set in the 30s and 40s. We tend to jump to the Nazi thing instead of communists, but communist demonstrators and bombers were a big concern in the 20s and 30s and were largely funded by the Bolsheviks in Russia. So it was something that there was a fair amount of public anxiety about. It's really cool that Walter Gibson is kind of hitting on the pulse of the public with this story. This is kind of a rip from the headlines in some ways kind of story. Maybe that's one of the reasons the Black Master is so, like his identity is so obvious. Readers of the time would have probably been more inclined to assume that it was communist bombers. I mean, I guess nowadays there have been a few communist pressure group bombings. Certainly in the 70s and 80s there were some. But, you know, it's not really something that's super ubiquitous, and it's certainly not something that the media likes to talk about a whole lot. So I think most readers would kind of assume that's a red herring, and it's sort of the closest we come to a red herring. If I were rewriting this book, I probably would have had maybe the inspector, James Burke, had him be a little bit of a red herring. Oh, it might be him. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there was a way to write this in such a manner that you could misdirect a bit more with regard to the Black Master's identity. But as I said, it doesn't really matter because the story is so strong, even if you know exactly who the Black Master is from the very first chapter. And I remember when I put up the audiobook, there were people saying, yeah, I pretty much guessed this guy's identity, like right from the beginning. Doesn't matter. It's more about the ride. It's more about the action. It's more about the atmosphere. And the Black Master is heavy on the atmosphere and the mystery, and the mechanics of how the story is put together are interesting enough that it doesn't really spoil anything. There's some cool little gimmicks in here. So everybody's wondering, the Black Master is creating these bombs. It's clear that he has used the expertise of former communist or current communist, we're not really sure, terrorists who had been bomb makers, and that he had used their expertise to create the bombs initially. And we think at first glance, okay, they were the ones who made the bombs and gave it to the Black Master and what have you. But it becomes very, very clear very, very quickly that the Black Master has either learned from those diagrams or whatever, he's taken them apart and figured out how they work. He begins carrying out bombings himself, and worse still, he begins carrying out much more sophisticated bombings. I love the gimmick where later in the story it turns out that the triggering mechanism in these, and the reason why we call him the Black Master, I mean, yes, he does have his little hideout, he wears all black, I mean, there's that gimmick that's kind of a through line, but the big reason he got the eponym of the Black Master is because he gives all of his henchmen black metal tokens that they carry in their pocket. It's just a piece of metal that is painted black. This is a genius little conceit from Gibson that you don't realize the importance of until later. I love this kind of stuff in Gibson's writing. Other crime writers don't have that kind of attention to detail. You can tell some of these stories are kind of written out from these sort of details, and I would not be surprised to find out that Gibson used this as sort of a gimmick. But it turns out that the metal is actually a piece of radium, and that it's the radiation that is attuned to, that the bombs are attuned to the radiation level, and so that's what triggers the explosions. I absolutely love that. I also love how Gibson doesn't really reveal that until the absolute end of the, like literally like the second to last chapter or something, and that's the crucial clue that finally tells quote unquote Henry Arnault, and in reality the Shadow, who the identity of the Black Master is, although he had already suspected it.
Those bombs that you pretended to be a mystery,
continued the Shadow.
The key to them lay in the black discs, the tokens of the Master. The sensitive mechanism of the bombs responded only to the presence of a metal which contained a mild radium activity. Its glow was concealed by the black surface. Each token and all your followers carried one. Set off a bomb when the victim came close to it. I should have known it when Warfield entered the office in the financial building, but I did not understand it until now.
And again, however obvious the identity of the primary antagonist is, I think the strongest thing about it is that I think Walter Gibson put a little bit more thought into, okay, what would drive somebody to do something this elaborate? Would it actually be just a random hood off the street? Because look, the Shadow has fought random hoods off the street. He's fought inveterate criminals and crime lords and gangsters. He fought a thinly veiled stand-in for Al Capone during one of the stories. I mean, there are definitely some dyed-in-the-dung gangsters that have been in these stories up until this point. But this particular villain is unique among them in that not only is he a supervillain, not only is he a better drawn supervillain than the Red Envoy was, and then some of the later villains actually will be. Although I do think a couple stories from now, when he does a little story called Double Z, he might actually get a little bit closer to the mark, but the Black Master is a slightly stronger story, in my opinion. But the interesting thing about this is there's a thematic level. Look, the strongest Batman villains, I think a lot of people would agree at this point, the strongest Spider-Man villains for that matter, are people who were faced with a similar challenge as the hero, right? A similar moment where they suffered a tragedy, a personal loss, the kind of personal loss that Spider-Man suffered and Superman suffered and Batman suffered and so on. And instead of making the noble choice to turn that into something constructive, they instead indulged their entitled impulses and took that out on the rest of the world, right? They took the darker road. It's the difference really between maybe a slightly darker version of Daredevil versus Punisher, right? But Daredevil-Punisher is a big rivalry that's been going in comics for a long, long time. Punisher takes the darker road. Oh, I'm just going to kill lots and lots of criminals. I'm going to get revenge. Whereas Daredevil's all about justice. No, he can certainly have his own personal motivations, and sometimes he lapses pretty close to vengeance and has even crossed the line a few times. But Daredevil's mostly about nobility and the embrace of the concept of justice. The Shadow, similarly, we really have a moment where not only do we strongly cast the villain in terms of his motivations, but, and this is the great thing about all the great antagonists, all the members of Batman's Rogues Gallery, and certainly now, as you can see, this is something that was present in the Shadow that Batman cribbed. This is something that through the villain, you learn more about the Shadow. And I love this exchange right here. I've included it in, I included it in a video that I did recently called Reject Modernity, Embrace Pulp. Strongly suggest that you check that out. But I included it in that. And of course, I enjoyed recording it in the audiobook. It's one of my favorite exchanges between the Shadow and a villain ever, because it's a moment where the Shadow kind of acknowledges, okay, this guy is a villain, but there's something else to it.
The Shadow was free to act with his enemy but a few feet away. He made no action. He knew too well the powerful forces at the disposal of the Black Master. One false motion would mean instant death. "Perhaps you wonder why I do not kill you," said the Black Master in a low, unchanging voice. "I shall tell you why. You are the only living man whom I have not cared to kill. You have sought to ferret out my crimes. You have discovered some of them, but not all. Let me ask you, and you may reply if you wish. Why do you seek to destroy me?" The Shadow laughed in a low, hissing tone.
"I seek to destroy you,"
he said in a sibilant, whispering voice.
"because you are a creature of crime. You have brought death upon those who have not deserved it."
"You too have resorted to crime," replied the Black Master.
"Not unless the end has justified the means."
With me. There was a chuckle from the curtain. It is the means that justifies the end. You are the only man in all the world who is like myself. Why should we care for human life? To me, human beings are stupid, useless creatures with which the earth is overburdened.
And perhaps it's because the agents don't feature quite as heavily in this particular story, but I find that in those kind of stories, in those pulp novels, those are the ones where we tend to pick up little details about the Shadow himself. I mean, it makes sense. Look, if you can't sort of dazzle the audience with whatever's happening or not happening to the agents as much, and indeed, Harry Vincent only features in 1 or 2 chapters here, and he doesn't do a whole lot of much, although he does manage to get himself kidnapped and electrocuted, because, guys, he's Harry Vincent, that's the law. But regardless, it's interesting. You kind of have to get a little bit more into the Shadow and what his background is, what motivates him. And one of the more interesting reveals, if you've always wondered, like, oh, why does the Shadow have such a big schnoz? Why does he look so strange and what have you? Well, the answer is quite simple. That may or may not even be his real face.
An arm came from the curtain. It reached forward and plucked the black hat from the Shadow's head. A low sound of amazement came from the curtain when the face of the Shadow was revealed. "The secret of the Shadow," came the monotonous voice. "At last it is understood. The man of many faces, with no face of his own."
And as we're on the subject of Batman and the whole dynamic of the supervillain revealing more about the hero and so on, you may actually recognize the climax, or at least the climactic quandary that results from Zerndorf and the Shadow finally meeting from the climax to the film The Dark Knight, because that's essentially what the conceit is, that the Black Master has set a bunch of bombs and the Shadow doesn't have enough time to actually defuse all of them.
Vervix simply followed my instructions. He also made the time bombs and the radio bombs, the other 2 types. Those are the ones that I am using now. The emphasis on the last words had an effect upon the Shadow. He knew that Zerndorf's schemes were not yet ended. He waited patiently, hoping for further information. He was not to be disappointed. "I have told you this to please myself," declared Zerndorf. "You are the only man who can appreciate my cleverness." At this moment, 3 giant bombs are placed. One is under the base of the Manhattan Bridge. The second is buried in the depths of the vehicular tunnel that leads to New Jersey. The third is in the largest hospital in New York City. How I have placed them there is a mere matter of detail. I have done it myself within the past week, and it was a labor of delight. Tonight, those bombs will explode simultaneously. You ask me when? It is now nearly 11 o'clock. They will go off at midnight.
Man, this is just a winner. This story's a winner from beginning to end. If you guys want to read a classic superhero, supervillain story with the Shadow and Walter Gibson, frankly, at the height of some of his creativity, although perhaps not as refined as he would become later on with other supervillain stories like the Voodoo Master and, of course, all the Shiwan Khan stuff, maybe the Prince of Evil, although that was a Theodore Tinsley thing. Maybe not quite as polished, but man, the creativity here is incredibly vibrant. If you need to read this story, well, first off, I did an audiobook of it. If you're not into audiobooks or you can't hear for some reason, first off, how are you listening to this? And second off, if you actually want to read it in a physical format, the best way to go, I find, is the old yellow paperbacks, whether it's the Pyramids or what have you, because this was only, I have no idea why Anthony Tollin did this, or Will Murray or whatever. When they were reprinting these stories, they decided for some bizarre reason to include the Black Master in an annual. They didn't devote a proper issue to The Black Master, which is in my eyes one of the very best stories in the Shadow's canon, never mind in his early canon. And so it wound up shoved into this random annual. It's like the second annual of the Sanctum reprints. Shockingly hard to find. I mean, one time I saw one on eBay. It wasn't even that long ago. And it wound, I just out of curiosity, I watched it, and the darn thing went for almost $200, which, boy, that guy's, whoever got that is going to feel like a clown buying a $15 book for $200 whenever these go back into print, as they inevitably will. I mean, they just rescinded the publishing rights for the pulps. What do you guys think? They're not going to reprint these things? They're clearly getting ready for another run here, and people are buying these books for over $100. Are you out of your minds, people? But that's just part of the supply and demand. There were not many of these made back in the day, and so the price is going to go up in commensurate amount. But eventually, these are going to go back into print. If you want to read The Black Master, I mean, I've seen copies of the yellow paperbacks for like $15, $17. That's a little bit of an elevated price, honestly. For years and years and years, they were like $4 and $5. I have a feeling people like myself out there making people aware of the Shadow. I noticed quite a few YouTubers have hopped on that ever since I did my videos. I suspect that's having a bit of an effect in terms of elevating the price here and causing the demand to somewhat skyrocket. But regardless, get your hands on The Black Master somehow, some way. This is an absolute winner. One of Walter Gibson's best, and certainly one of the best from the initial 10 stories. And what have I said many, many times? If you're going to get into the Shadow pulps, as we certainly are on this season, the Pulp Avenger. We got one more episode left in this season, by the way. And on the Pulp Avenger, we are going through all of the first 10 Shadow stories. We, of course, had already covered The Living Shadow, so we sort of started out with Eyes of the Shadow, and now we're already 8 in, guys, and we are talking about one of the best stories there is. If you're going to grab this story, hit up eBay, hit up Amazon. I've seen them for reasonable prices, but I wouldn't bother with the annual, not least of which because there's not a big reason to, whereas some of the other pulp reprints are going to have full illustrations. These early Shadow pulp novels were not fully illustrated. All they had was a frontispiece. I mean, you might get some extra stuff, although in an annual with a bunch of stories, I think it was like 3 different stories reprinted. I doubt there's all that much bonus information from Will Murray in terms of the intermissions that are included in every single volume. So honestly, there's not a whole lot of reason to pay exorbitant sums of money to buy a $15 annual book for hundreds of dollars like an idiot. So regardless, guys, highly recommend it. Pick it up. The Black Master.
Today's drama, Séance with Death.
Continuing on, we now review a fine radio drama from actually sort of the latter days of the Shadow, at least in the radio relaunch, that it was, of course, originally inhabited by Orson Welles, moved on to Mr. Bill Johnstone, ultimately ends up with Brett Morrison. Then Brett Morrison bows out for reasons that have never been made completely clear. There's lots of rumors. He moved to a different place. He was originally in the Chicago theater. He possibly went into the army, whatever it was. I've heard a lot of contradictory tales. A book that I've read, actually, by Martin Grahams Jr., talks about some of those rumors and also establishes that really it hasn't been definitively established. But regardless, Brett Morrison winds up coming back into the role, and he winds up inhabiting the slouch hat and the cape. In fact, he literally wore them in the studio, unlike some of the other actors, for the next 10 years, something like that. The longest serving Shadow actor, and my personal favorite, you just cannot beat that Brett Morrison Shadow laugh, for crying out loud. And also probably the actor that took it a little bit more seriously than some of the other actors. So I always appreciate a good Brett Morrison shadow tale. I'm a big fan of his era. This particular drama is called Séance with Death. Well, of course, it's got to have death in the title because it's the Shadow radio drama, and by God, that's in the Constitution somewhere, I'm sure. They always had to have of death, with death, whatever. But this is an interesting one in that the core conceit here is we open on a murder, of course.
The door to the bedroom of a large suite in a fashionable midtown apartment opens. A tall, dignified man enters, walks over to the telephone next to the bed. He hesitates for a moment. Then, as though reaching a decision, removes the instrument from its hook.
Number, please.
Get me police headquarters, operator.
1 moment, please.
What do you want? What do you want?
I'm ringing that number, sir.
Never mind it now. Look, I wasn't going to call the police, honest. I'll make a deal with you. I've got plenty on all of you, but I'll tear it up. Honest, I will.
And of course, the reason why this is interesting is because this actually relates to Walter B. Gibson in real life. For those of you who have done any research into the life of Walter B. Gibson, you know that initially he kind of started his writing career exposing things like carnival tricks and false spiritualists and so forth. But Walter Gibson, as he went on in life, particularly after he married Litska, who was the former wife of the great Raymond, I believe, he actually began to kind of at least explore. I don't know if he was an ardent believer in it, but he became much more open to what I guess debunkers and skeptics would call woo-woo, right? And so it was ideas like seances and the dead and ghosts and goblins and all that good stuff, right? So this actually deals with a core premise in this episode that would be fairly close to Walter B. Gibson's heart, but this in itself was not actually written by Walter Gibson. There have been rumors for many years, never actually quantified, but rumors, nevertheless, that Walter Gibson did submit scripts to the Shadow. Now, he said in his life that he submitted scripts. They were never accepted. He wanted to get in on the radio show, but never did. But the thing is, there was a big practice at the time of people just submitting anonymous scripts and them being published on the radio. This actually did happen at the time. So the likelihood that somebody, a writer as prolific as Walter Gibson, could have snuck one in if he really wanted to get it on the air is actually fairly high. So it's not completely outside the realm of possibility. But all these decades later, for it not to have been confirmed, I tend to kind of doubt it, right? This episode deals with kind of a lot of public anxieties at the time. The emergence of psychiatry as a bona fide profession, and so there's a bit of paranoia about that. The primary ringleader here is actually a psychiatrist who uses knowledge from his patients and passes them along to a guy who carries out a seance named Swami. And actually, I would say this plot, which doesn't even sound that complicated, maybe a little bit too complicated for radio, somewhat convoluted when you're actually listening to it. This is one of those episodes of the Shadow radio show that you actually kind of have to pay attention to a little bit. So the guy who's killed in the beginning knows about their schemes and is ready to let it slip, and so they kill him. But the problem, of course, is that there's still the matter of his daughter. Now, they keep him in the dark primarily by keeping her enthralled to the doc, who is, of course, an out-and-out quack. Now, the doc knows hypnotism because it's the 1940s, and, of course, every villain knows it, along with most superheroes. And so what does he do? Well, we recycle an old plot from, many, many episodes ago, the very first season of the Shadow Radio show, The Temple Bells of Nabon, where Margot Lane was hypnotized into taking a shot at Lamont Cranston. And of course, as Lamont Cranston immediately takes interest in the murder of this guy and in protecting his daughter, what should the doctor do? Well,
Cranston's too smart to let Robbie get close enough. The girl will have to do it.
Consuelo? You're nuts. She won't do it.
Yes, she will.
condition her to hypnosis. You can put her under in a second. Get rid of Jackson. Then tell her exactly what she's to do and leave her with a post-hypnotic suggestion that later she will remember nothing.
You sure this is okay, Doc?
Absolutely. She'll walk up to Cranston, let him and Miss Lane have it, then forget all about it. What could be sweeter and sweeter?
Suelo, is anything wrong? You feel all right?
I have something for you, Mr. Cranston. Something I must give you.
Yes? What is it, Consuelo?
This, Mr. Cranston.
What? It's a gun.
I must kill you.
Put away that gun, Consuelo.
No, Mr. Cranston.
Consuelo!
Don't come any closer.
Look out, Ramon!
One of the better old-timey cliffhangers, actually, in the history of the Shadow, in my opinion. But one of the weaker return lines. You know, every single time you have one of these cliffhangers where somebody takes pot shots at Lamont Cranston, you got to explain why he's not dead when you come back from commercial break. In this case, a Kerry's Salt commercial. For those who don't know, Blue Coal, of course, is the one everybody remembers. But one of the other really big sponsors throughout the 40s and during the Brett Morrison years of the Shadow was Kerry's Salt, which you can actually still find. That's actually a product that, unlike Blue Coal, was not taken down by the Jimmy Hoffa situation. The explanation for why they are not mortally ended, you ask? Oh, we moved out of the way at the last second. That's literally the explanation. I just absolutely love it. It's so cheesy old-time radio. But this is a cool little premise. And also an interesting fact. I mentioned this related to Walter B. Gibson, the subject of seances, even if they are fake. But the seance issue is particularly pertinent to Walter B. Gibson because, of course, he was acquainted with Houdini. They were part of the same Magician Society back in the day. And he was, of course, working on a biography for Harry Houdini when he died and writing articles about him in newspapers that were eventually compiled into biographies. And an interesting fact is that Walter Gibson was, of course, involved, annually in the Harry Houdini seance, which is now, it's still an event. It's still ongoing. It's still a big, big thing in paranormal circles and, of course, magician circles, because it's so much paranormal activity has been reported whenever people attempt to commune with the spirit of Harry Houdini. And actually, there's some cool little factoids, not just in the Walter B. Gibson biography that came out not long ago, but in some of his personal writings. I mean, Walter Gibson talked about Harry Houdini a fair amount. They were actually really well acquainted. They didn't always get along. There's some cool anecdotes in the Walter Gibson biography about them actually, Houdini flying into rages and actually getting to the point where Walter Gibson, who didn't have much of a temper himself, actually exploded at Harry Houdini a few times, which is kind of interesting. But with that assassination attempt sort of foiled, the Shadow then has to riposte in some way. And the way that he reckons to do it is actually very interesting for this time period. Look, at the early days, of course, one of the big differences you notice, apart from the changes in actors, is the early Orson Welles stuff dealt heavily in hypnotism. The very first episode, in fact, Death House Rescue, involves basically telepathy. The Shadow literally reads Gordon's mind in order to discern what happened with the crime, that he's sort of falsely accused of, right, in prison.
I told everything I know in court. They wouldn't believe me then.
Because you couldn't prove what you said. We are going after the proof now. You and I.
How?
I'm going to think with your mind.
I don't know what you mean.
Don't try to understand. Just do as I tell you. I want you to concentrate, Gordon. Fix your mind on everything that happened that day. Make mental pictures. I'll see what you see.
Cool fact about that episode, which we already, of course, reviewed on an earlier episode of the Shadowcast. The voice of Gordon there is provided by none other than Bill Johnstone, who would wind up being Orson Welles' successor in the Shadow role and do a fine job for, I believe, 5 years he was in that role. But this is an example of the hypnotism that featured very, very heavily in the early years and then fell by the wayside. By the time Bill Johnstone took over, It was pretty much done. He stopped. Essentially, the only hypnotic aspect of the character was, he's beclouding people's minds. That was and it became essentially a gimmick. He was basically just the Invisible Man. Well, this is a rare example in the heart of the 40s, really the tail end of the 40s, long after that gimmick had been dispensed with, of reusing kind of plot points from the late 30s. So you have the girl who's hypnotized into trying to take a shot at Lamont Cranston. That's reused from a prior episode. And you have the use of hypnotism. So one wonders if the writing staff on this one didn't actually look at those prior episodes when drafting this one.
Well, I hope you know what you let yourself in for, Lamont.
I think that girl can help me smash this racket, Margot.
But how? She doesn't even remember anything.
Not consciously, Margot. Maybe the Shadow can decipher the secret from her unconscious mind.
This is a very classic sort of Shadow setup, right? What is the recurrent element of the radio show, if not presenting the possibility of the supernatural and then ultimately debunking it? The Pulp is the very same way. There's really only one episode, which was repeated a few times, where essentially, and I'm blanking on exactly what the title of it is, but it's an episode where they suggest the presence of alien visitors. And it's not that they ratify that they are actually alien visitors, but they don't debunk it by the end of the episode. And so that was somewhat unusual at the time. But honestly, like, this is a case where, okay, we've got the possibility of a seance. And so ultimately, after Lamont Cranston quizzes the girl and she tells him where the Swami is actually hiding, he goes to his place and discovers that, discovers the man behind the curtain, in short.
What was that? It sounded like...
Wait.
Consuelo, my child, you have come at last to your father.
There's someone in this room, Lamont. Let's get... Look over there in the cabinet. A man.
That, darling, is Mr. Sanders, if I'm not mistaken.
Sanders? But he's dead. Get me out of here,
Now, wait a
Lamont.
minute, Margot. Now, these are all tricks.
What?
Watch. I bring out the astral horn by pushing this button. The voice of the control spirit by pushing this one.
Consuelo, my child, you have come at last to your father.
All tricks, Margot. Cruel tricks designed to get money from the bereaved and the credulous.
But how do they work?
The horn, recorded. It is the imitation of the voice of Sanders. As for the picture, just treat it with luminous paint. When I push the button, the dark cloth in front of it falls away and it glows in the dark.
Also, yet another really, really cool example of Brett Morrison's Shadow. This is kind of a fact particular to Brett Morrison's incarnation of the Shadow. He carries a gun. Orson Welles' Shadow was never really mentioned carrying a gun. I think it might have slipped out once or twice, maybe even in the case of Johnstone, but multiple times over the course of the Brett Morrison years, he is mentioned as carrying a gun, and here he actually threatens someone with it.
I thought you... Ed? Sorry to disappoint you, Robbie.
What do you want?
Facts. The facts on what's behind all this.
You can't make me talk.
Maybe you better help me tie Robbie up, Margot. Those cords from the drapery should do it.
Right.
I warn you, Robbie, I'll shoot at the slightest resistance.
Also a fun fact here is that when they actually... First, they just call him the Doc, right? They call the psychiatrist who's running this scam the Doc. But then ultimately, towards the end of the episode, we learn that his full name is actually Doc Samson. This is 1947, folks. Doc Samson didn't debut in Marvel Comics until 1971. So, kind of an interesting little factoid. Look, guys, Stan Lee copped to it years ago. This is nothing. He's like the anti-Bob Kane, who never admitted any of the stuff he stole. Stan Lee copped to the fact that he read pulp magazines all the time. He listened to old-time radio, and he stole ideas liberally. This is actually a Roy Thomas character, so in this case it would have been Roy Thomas, who, by the way, Roy Thomas is probably an even bigger pulp fan than Stan Lee. But yeah, so Doc Samson makes his debut here in Séance of Death.
All right, Margot, let's go.
What are you going to do?
First, make sure Consuelo's all right at your apartment. Then pay a visit to Doc Samson and the Swami.
And of course, Consuela as soon as she discovers the manipulation. Actually, she's Consuelo, but she's mispronounced as Consuela a number of times over the course of this story, so whatever. Regardless, she's tired of being manipulated, and so she, of course, confronts first the Swami, and I have to say, my goodness, do you need to brace for this one-liner.
Run along, Consuelo.
No.
Doc and I have some important business we must...
A voice told me to come to you, Swami.
Please, Consuelo. Later on, perhaps.
I want you to make a contact for me.
Look, Consuelo. Nobody on this plane can make a contact.
But you can, Swami.
Oh.
See, Swami? Now you can make the contact. You're no longer on this plane, are you?
You're no longer on this plane. That's almost 80s action movie worthy, I have to say. But it turns out that our ingenue is actually a femme fatale, as Doc Samson walks in, and it becomes abundantly clear that she's not the doe-eyed little foundling that she was portraying herself as.
Well, no, don't be hasty, my dear. Just as soon as Jackson signs over your inheritance, we'll go away together.
Oh, no, we won't, Doc. No, we won't. You see, you're the only one left who could tie me to this whole business and indirectly to the killing of my father.
But what can you gain by killing me?
Gain. When the police find you, this gun will be alongside you. It's the same gun that killed my father. The police will put two and two together, and then...
Forgotten the Swami, Consuelo.
What was that?
Swami! You're dead! I just killed you!
Don't you remember, Consuelo? Many of our dear departed that we think are gone forever are always with us.
It can't be true.
But it is.
I'll kill you!
With an empty gun?
I really like this one. It's got all the great elements of a truly good Shadow radio yarn. It's got the atmosphere. It's got the weird kind of, oh, is it really supernatural? But it turns out not to be kind of element. I mean, all the stuff that makes Shadow episodes worthwhile. This is cool. Of course, it turns out that Consuelo was manipulating everyone, that she was in league with Doc Samson, and that she was actually just cleaning up her mess when she was killing all of the other people. This is just a great one. Gotta say, guys, if you're sleeping on the Brett Morrison stuff, if all you've listened to is the Orson Welles era, you are way missing out, especially on good murder mysteries and supernatural stuff. The best Brett Morrison stuff absolutely features that in abundance. Séance with Death, a recommended radio diversion, straight from the pen of Frank Kane, I should say. He was the one who wrote the script for this in 1947. In May of 1947, I believe it aired. He's not really all that well known, but he was a pulp writer par excellence. He wrote a lot of radio scripts, did some Nick Carter as well as The Shadow, a lot of stuff, Crime Busters. He was one of those guys, right? Really a writer for hire, especially after World War II. And probably his most famous moment was when his book was turned into the 1960 neo-noir film Key Witness, which stars Dennis Hopper, I believe. So some people have probably seen it, but it didn't do that well at the time. Interesting little movie. You should go check it out. Folks, that will do it for the Shadowcast. On this particular edition, I am already formulating the next episode, so there won't be a really long wait until the next one, I promise. But in the meantime...
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.